everybody was in a happy mood because it was, hey, if this is going to be the way 1976 is going to be, it's going to be great, you know, because this was beautiful weather, you know, like Florida. But it was short-lived.
It was a very weird feeling day. I was with my mother and my aunts till about 4:30, and as I was leaving them, I very flippantly said to them, "Oh, I hope I don't get blown away by a tornado."
In fact, it's funny, growing up, as a kid, I remember thinking, you watch The Wizard of Oz and the tornado and all that, and I remember thinking to myself, I'd like to see a tornado, but I like to see it from a safe distance. To this day, maybe I'd like to see them from a safe distance, but I was a little too close that day.
National Weather Service put out a warning that the conditions were ripe for a major storm, thunderstorm, or tornado.
I just remember it being unusually warm, and I remember leaving my home at around noon to meet my mother and my aunts for lunch and then a day of shopping. And I remember it being warm and hearing that there were storm warnings, and throughout the day hearing those storm warnings repeated, that there was a tornado watch.
As I remember, I got up, it was in a bright sunshiny day, you know, and it looked like a spring day. You know, I thought, wow, this is great. It was a Saturday, so I had to go to downtown Detroit. I was on, I had a couple of assignments that I wanted to get done in Detroit. I had to stop off at the Burton Historical Collection to do some research. It hit 70 degrees, and people were walking around in their shirt sleeves. I mean, you know, it was funny. When I was on campus down there, all of the students were out walking around like it was almost a summer day.
I remember leaving the JCC at about maybe 10 to 7, and it was very quiet. It was raining, and then it got quiet, and the lightning was very unusual. It was like streaks and constant streaks. It was like a light show. And I thought that was strange, and I drove home, and it was very quiet. There was not a breeze, and the air was very heavy.
It was an unusual March because it was very, very warm. And I went over to a friend's house. Her name was Sally Dunn. And I remember thinking how unusual it was to go over her house and see her outside washing her car. And it was like a spring day. That just gives you an idea how warm it was that day. And I asked her if she wanted to go up to the marathon station at 15 Mile and Orchard Lake Road, it was Danny's Marathon. Danny was the owner of the gas station, because he had a truck that was for sale, and I was interested in looking at that truck, and I decided to ask her to come along. So we both went there, and that day on the radio, I remember hearing that there was a tornado watch, and I thought, well, that's really unusual for March to hear of a tornado watch. And didn't think much of it, because you hear those in the springtime and you just kind of, you know, dismiss them. You hear them, but you just dismiss them. So I remember as we pulled into the parking lot of the gas station, on the news they announced that the tornado watch had been canceled. But there was still the threat of possibly severe storms that day, thunderstorm watch, if you will. So didn't think anything of it, turned off the radio, went into the gas station, and we were looking at this truck and just talking among ourselves.
I got home a little bit after 7, maybe right around 7 o'clock, and I went into, my husband was sleeping, he was taking a nap, and I walked into our kitchen, which faced west, and we had a big picture window over the sink. And I was watching this lightning because it was so unusual. And I started to make dinner, and I called one of my girlfriends who lived in Oak Park at that time. And I was talking to her, and as I was talking to her and watching this lightning and preparing dinner, I saw an explosion. And I thought, oh my God. And then the power went out. It
started raining so hard that the gas pumps, maybe 50 feet away, we couldn't even see them. It was just torrential downpour. I've never seen it rain that hard. and it just stopped. And then you hear of people talking about this greenish glow, tornado, greenish glow or whatever, but that's exactly what I saw. Everything kind of got quiet and got greenish. And I remember looking out of the parking lot, and next to the gas pumps, there's a rack of tires. It's on wheels, and it's something they pull out to display the tires that were for sale. And there's probably a dozen or better tires on this thing. But I remember it just fell over on its side and just sort of sliding across the parking lot. It's like, what the heck's that about? So the owner of the gas station, and then it started raining again, the owner of the gas station, Danny, went over to the garage door and began to pull down the overhead glass doors. And then the last thing I remember was him going through those doors, leaving the building, as the building exploded.
And then the noise started. And my girlfriend's talking away in my ear, and I'm going, shh, 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 because the noise was something I had never heard before, and I couldn't place it, and it kept getting louder and louder and louder. I thought it was an airplane crashing in our backyard. The next thing I knew, the window imploded, and all the cabinets and the countertops went flying behind me. I mean, past me. I don't know if I was blown out of the kitchen or if I ran out of the kitchen, but an A-frame from the bank that was behind our house had come through our wall, and a 2x4 went flying by me and was embedded in the wall behind me. I had no clue what happened.
I don't remember anything after that because I was knocked out. I was buried in the building in the Marathon Station and was in a coma for 8 days, had a fractured skull and lost most of the hearing in my left ear, which has since come back to maybe 50%. But I remember waking up in the hospital and not knowing what had happened until my parents told me that there'd been a tornado, and they showed me all the newspaper clippings.
I didn't realize till afterward that I really had an out-of-body experience, because later, I remember almost seeing myself sitting up on one of the cupboards that didn't come down and watching this. It was very strange.
I didn't hear any noise. In fact, I remember it was very quiet for a moment because obviously the electricity went off. And the only thing we could hear was the rain. And then as soon as the wind was picking up, that's about the time the building imploded, and I don't remember anything after that.
I was out in our hallway, and my husband, and I was probably screaming, and my husband came running from the bedroom, and he was screaming, and we smacked into each other in the hallway because it was pitch black. Neither one of us knew what had happened, and my face was bleeding from all the glass, and I couldn't see. And I'm thinking, I'm blind. He kept saying, what happened, what happened, what happened? And I said, I don't know, I don't know. And all I wanted to do was get outside to see what had happened. And we didn't realize this till days later. He made me go get a flashlight and go into a room that hadn't been damaged and hold the flashlight while he combed his hair, because we hadn't met any of our neighbors yet. And so we stood there doing that. We didn't realize this till days later as we were processing it. But then we went outside, and we still had no idea. At this point, though, I can remember hearing screams and glass still breaking and sirens starting, and people were coming out of their homes. Nobody knew what had happened. There were no tornado warnings no sirens at that time.
Danny, he had the rope in his hands and he's pulling it down, and all of a sudden he was pulled out of the building. And some weeks later he came to my home and visited, and I asked him what happened to him, because I remember I told him what I saw, and he said, yeah, that's exactly what happened. I got sucked out those glass doors. And he said that he landed in the middle of the parking lot, and that a pickup truck landed next to him upside down, and he said he was able to hang on to the pickup truck and ride out the storm. But he said that he remembers getting hit by all the debris at 200 plus miles an hour. He got things, bricks and stones and glass and everything flying at him. So he got really beat up pretty bad. And my friend Sally, who was in the gas station, she got cut up pretty bad. But she was never knocked unconscious. In fact, she helped find me and get me out of the building when the fire department arrived and the help arrived.
And I got through dinner probably at about 7:30, hopped in the car and was on my way back to West Bloomfield, where I lived, on Castleton Drive. It's along the southern border of West Bloomfield, 14 mile between Middle Belt and Northwestern Highway. And as I got near that intersection, I saw that all the lights were out. All of a sudden it was pitch black. All it was the headlights of my car and cars that were going with me out Northwestern Highway. I thought, what the heck goes? I didn't put the radio on. But when I turned on the 14-mile road to head east, to go down to Heather Heath and go into my subdivision, everything was black, you know. And I thought, boy, is this strange? It must have been some kind of a storm. I'd heard nothing. But when I pulled into the house and came in, and I said to my wife, Nancy, I said, what's happened? She said, haven't you heard? And I said, no, I didn't have the radio on. She said, well, there's been a tornado. I said, how's my son, Chris? Chris was upstairs in the bedroom. And he had the flu. He'd been out of school for a couple of days and probably going to go back the following Monday. But he was asleep, and he was awakened from a sound sleep with the sound of like a railroad train, going through the sky. And he thought, what the heck is this? So he got up out of bed, and he could stand up in his bed and look out our rear window in the northwest corner of our house. He couldn't see the intersection of Orchard Lake and Maple, but he could see the effect of a huge bloom of light explode, and then everything went black. That's when the lights went out all over. And that occurred just about 7-something in the evening, as I recall, 7:15 or 7:20, when it struck that intersection. If memory serves me correctly, it was an F4, and that's good size storm, yeah. I had heard later that the wind velocity was somewhere between 240 to 260 miles per hour. Now that's pretty strong, if that was an accurate figure, and indeed the source was the weather station, then that was one hunk of wind.
And coming back in and seeing the destruction and the damage was, that's probably the closest I've ever come to fainting, because we really didn't see the extent of the damage.
I surveyed the damage the following day, and that was difficult. I didn't want to get over there too early. I went over in the afternoon. I thought things would quiet down. Of course, we had to park on the south side of West Maple. I say we. I did go by myself, as I recall, and I took along my big camera with me. This Pentax 6x7, it weighed about, I don't know how many pounds, and it had it in a big silver box. And that was the first time that I saw the impact behind the Detroit Bank and Trust branch on the northeast corner of Orchard Lake and Maple. I could get into that subdivision, and I walked in, and I remember taking a photograph, which appears in Song of the Heron as one of the illustrations on the tornado. And I remember taking a picture of the house and looking at the devastation and saying, oh my God. And freakish things happened. I mean, you could find pianos or tables standing on top of concrete bases where a house once stood. The house is gone, but there's a table with a lamp standing on it, or a table with a vase standing on it. In fact, there was a piano, I think, also that was left in the devastation of a house. The house was practically totally obliterated, but there was a piano. It was freakish the way it went on.
As a housewarming gift, one of my dearest friends had given me a piece of pottery vase, and it was in the kitchen, and we found it the next day unbroken on our front lawn. Yeah.
When the tornado hit Bell Tire, they were having a 60% tire sale on that day. And as I wrote in Song of the Heron, those tires, and literally, they were blown out of the place, and they took off like a flock of black frisbees flying over West Bloomfield, which must have been quite a sight. After it impacted Bell Tire, it hit the gasoline station right in front of that building at the very corner, and at the very southwest corner, and then came down, crossed the street, creating havoc at that particular point because there was traffic at that intersection, and then hit the next gasoline station on the northeast corner, and behind that Bell Tire. And that was the major focus of the damage. There was other terrible damage done in the various housing project areas, but that damage there was the one that was focused on so much because it was the scene of where Kylie Weaver lost her life at that particular stage. She was in a car with 3 other occupants, and they were heading east from Bloomfield. And when they reached that intersection, the driver, Pete Wilson, was in the wrong lane. He was in the center lane, and he had to turn left because he was taking his friends to the Bloomfield Canopy restaurant, which was 100 yards south of that intersection, on the other side, on the west side of Orchard Lake Road. So he was caught there, and the tornado came down, picked up his car, spun it around, and dropped it on the underside of another vehicle. It actually was, his vehicle was upright, but the one underneath it was turned upside down. And Pete and the other 2 occupants in the back seat survived with minor injuries, but Kylie was unfortunately killed. And the press focused in on that because here was this young, teenage girl, in the, beginning of life, and had her life snuffed out by this horrible storm, which spared the lives of her comrades in that car, as well as the lives of the people on whose car they fell down on top of, And the storm probably only lasted about 10 minutes or so on the ground from the time it, hit until the time it, it departed. And it departed up in the Walnut Lake area, in the bay, the south bay of Walnut Lake. That's the last time we saw it, thank God.
I got home about 7. The tornado happened at 7:17, I believe. And I'm thinking maybe it really lasted a minute in my vicinity, and probably not even that, but it seemed like hours. It was, like you said, it was very traumatizing.
There was another tornado that same evening that struck Macomb County. I know there was a single death there, and I know some damage was done, but I don't think it was to anywhere near the extent of the impact that was felt here in West Bloomfield.
We didn't know what to do, where to go. Our neighbor was wonderful. His house hadn't been damaged very much, and he actually helped us board up a little bit of it, and then he said, there was really too much. And so we just left, and we went to my parents' house and slept there that night.
The general reaction at first was shock, real shock. That night, after the storm hit, after 7 o'clock, people were shocked because all they had was word that they had picked up from friends who had been in the area and had driven on the edge of the tornado and came back to say, that was horrible, whatever happened, So there was initial shock. Neighbor helped neighbor. In the areas that were heavily damaged, it was the neighbor who went next door to find out how his neighbor was. And that's the core of any community. You look out for one another, and that was typical in West Bloomfield at that time.
We were in a hotel for 6 weeks, and it was probably a good year before the neighborhood seemed to be back almost to where it was.
The part that I remembered the most and felt bad about the most was what I put my parents through. Especially now I look back and think, what if that happened to one of my sons? But I remember how upset my parents were, and I really felt bad about that, even though there's nothing I could do about that. And that was just their way of showing genuine love and concern, but I felt bad that I put them through that.
Depending on the severity of the storm, I still get a little anxious. I don't think I would go down the basement quite as quickly now, but I still get anxious.
People came from near and far after the tornado hit. The sightseers, the bystanders, and in some cases people who wanted to steal objects. Fortunately, those were in the latter, were in the minority. And the police quickly apprehended anybody who was trying to liberate somebody's household goods after their house had been blown apart by a tornado. But I think that after the crowds left and there was work going forward to restore these buildings, the restoration page, it kept in mind. But after that, it kind of, went away. We lost track of that as being kind of a major event and a warning to us because it can happen again. This time we'll probably be better prepared, but it is a terrible event. We can't live in worry about things like that and fear something that hasn't happened, but we should always have our antenna up to make sure that we're plugged in if a storm like that comes back.